This week, Maksim Goldenshteyn, a Russian-speaking Jew in Seattle, just published arguably the foremost book about Romania's role in the Holocaust, centered on the survival story of his Ukrainian Jewish family. So Goldenshteyn and I have a very personal conversation about Holocaust memory as Soviet Jews. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. If you like this podcast or Jewfolk generally and the work that we do, support us by buying our merch. We recently updated our store, so when you're really exhausted about everything, pick up a shirt that says, "The Jews are tired, stop tweeting like now." Or for your morning coffee, start your day with a mug that has the Jews Are Tired podcast logo on it. People will get the hint, I think, and we've got tons of other designs you should check out. The point is, a link to our Teespring store is available in the podcast notes, so please check it out. And there's also a link to donate to Jewfolk in the podcast notes if you just want to give directly. We appreciate any support you can give. Now, to set the stage for my conversation with Maksim Goldenshteyn about his book, So They Remember, a Jewish Family's Story of Surviving the Holocaust in Soviet Ukraine. In full disclosure, he originally sent me a pre-publication PDF of the book, but I bought a physical copy anyway, and you know what? You should too, so links to buy the book are in the podcast notes. Seriously, do it. Now, you'll have to bear with me for a little bit because there is a lot of important background on Eastern Europe to understand here. Goldenshteyn was born in southwestern Ukraine in the Soviet Union, and at the age of 3 in the early 1990s, he and his family immigrated to the United States, settling in Seattle, Washington. A pretty common Russian-speaking Jewish immigration story. Something else common for basically every Russian-speaking Jew is a particularly brutal Holocaust history that isn't well known by most American Jews, let alone most people. The Holocaust is most often associated with Nazi concentration camps in Poland and Germany, most prominently Auschwitz. But almost half of all Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust, so roughly 3 million Jews, died in Eastern Europe, on the territory of the Soviet Union. And mostly they were not killed in concentration camps, they were just shot in ravines and hastily dug trenches and pits in forests by Nazis, but also often with the help of local collaborators. So many Soviet Jews who went to fight with the Red Army against Nazi Germany came back after the war to find their families and their communities wiped out. And many of them often continued living near the neighbors that had either been around when their families were killed or who had helped with the murders. Nowadays, thanks to recent scholarship around this, specifically a book by a French Catholic priest actually, this is referred to as the Holocaust by Bullets, which is also the name of the book, which you can find linked to in the podcast notes. Still, there are other aspects of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe that even less is known about. So coming back to Maksim Goldenshteyn, growing up, he assumed the Holocaust was, again, all the stuff we usually think about in Germany and Poland, and it never really crossed his mind that his family had survived the Holocaust because nobody in the family really talked about it. But about a decade ago, fresh out of college and working as a journalist in his early 20s, Goldenshteyn discovered that his family not only had survived the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, but that it wasn't Nazis who featured in the story, it was Romanians. To make a very long story short, Romania in the early 1940s was taken over by its own fascist and anti-Semitic dictator who allied with Hitler. And when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Romania joined the invasion and got to take over a slice of southwestern Ukraine, a territory known as Transnistria. That's where Goldenshteyn's grandfather, Motul Braverman, was growing up, and where, as the Romanians worked on their own final solution to the Jewish problem, Motul's family and other Ukrainian Jews in Transnistria, along with many Romanian Jews, were rounded up and brought to concentration camps, where the conditions were so bad that even the Nazis were ashamed to be associated with Romanians. Jews who were not shot dead immediately were left to die of starvation and disease in these camps, of which the most notorious is a place called Peshera. That's where Motul Braverman and his family were kept, a place that prisoners named the Death Noose because the living were trapped and the only escape was death. Only a fifth of the prisoners held at Peshera survived the camp. But Motul Braverman not only survived, he actually helped other prisoners escape and led them to safety. And this is the just insane story Goldenshteyn came across, asked his grandfather about, and wrote about in this book. But his book also ties in what happened after the Holocaust, how Goldenshteyn's family survived the Soviet Union and dealt with the way Soviet authorities suppressed any mention of the Holocaust, which, by the way, is part of the reason the Holocaust in Eastern Europe doesn't get a lot of attention. Many Holocaust survivors in Central and Western Europe could leave for places like America and eventually talk about their experience. But those options were not available to Soviet Jews until the 1980s, and even then the conversation was not very open in the Soviet Union. So all of these things, the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, Goldenshteyn's family history, his personal story of discovering that history, and the lack of attention to the subject come together with a lot of power and a lot of bitterness in this book. And that's precisely why I wanted to talk with him on this podcast. For listeners who may somehow not know, I am also a Russian-speaking Jew with family from Ukraine and Belarus that immigrated here in the 1980s, and an Eastern European Holocaust history that has never fit into the understanding most American Jews or people have about the Holocaust. And that has created a lot of bitterness for me and my family. And it's kind of amazing to get to have an open conversation about that with Goldenshteyn. Really, this is a story about challenging what most people know about a very popularized event, challenging the idea that Jews were just victims and didn't fight back, defend themselves, or free themselves during the Holocaust, challenging the very narrow focus on Nazi Germany in these events, and challenging ourselves, the next generation of Jews, and in this case specifically the next generation of Russian-speaking Jews, about how we save and process and transmit our history down the line to future generations. I really, really appreciate Goldenshteyn for coming on the podcast to speak with me and opening up about all of this. This was an extremely personal and really important conversation to have for me. And it's also a particularly poignant and weird moment to have this conversation as we're all looking at the disastrous war crime that is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which started roughly a week ago. Goldenshteyn and I talk a little bit about that near the end of the podcast, but if you want a primer, there's a link in the podcast notes to a personal piece by me about what you need to know about this war and why it's so important to support Ukraine. Okay, with all of that background out of the way, I hope you get as much out of this interview as I did and buy the book so they remember. This conversation has been edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. So first of all, I want to follow the breadcrumbs of how you learned about your family's Holocaust history, because you only heard the details once you were in your 20s, but you write a couple of examples in the book of hints that were dropped, from the more explicit, like your grandma half telling you the story of sneaking out of the ghetto, to the, I don't know if this counts as subtle, but the paranoia and anxiety of your grandparents. Can you say more about picking up on these clues while growing up and what they made you think about your family before you knew the full context?
Yes, well, I think my grandmother on my mother's side, Anna, she was really the only one that so much as probably hinted to me that my family had survived the Holocaust. She told me a story at least a few times I remember growing up, about how when she was 4 years old during the German, first the German and then the Romanian occupation, she had once basically in the ghetto that she was in with her family, although she didn't use the word ghetto, but she described leaving this ghetto and deciding that she would walk to her old house and to retrieve some dolls and toys that she had that she was missing. And I think at an opportune moment when no one was looking, maybe the adults weren't present, she basically just walked through or maybe crossed through some barbed wire, I'm assuming, and literally just appeared at her old doorstep one day. And her neighbors spotted her. They helped her find her toys, and then they gave her some food to bring back, which she did. And she returned to the ghetto with her family, not even having noticed. And so that was kind of perplexing for me to hear as a child, because again, it didn't really comport with this model of the Holocaust that I had been accustomed to, sealed walls, guards at every turn, this sort of thing. And then, I remember her telling me quite often also about her father and how, he'd fought in the Red Army and he'd never returned. And she would often tear up. Even as a young child, she would tear up to me in telling the story. I think it was probably one of the saddest things that had ever happened to her, understandably. No one else really talked to me about the war or our past. My grandfather, he was a little bit skittish about, telling people that we were Jewish, so that kind of struck me as odd sometimes. But I myself kind of felt the same way, growing up. I was very, anxious about my identity and not necessarily wanting to sort of go there. And maybe that was tied up in the fact that, we were immigrants. And that, being Jewish was telling somebody that I was Jewish or explaining my last name would somehow, get into the whole story of the fact that, we were different, that it would sort of betray the idea that I was just an ordinary American like everybody else. So I think there was a lot tied up in identity as a whole.
But as you heard these pieces and nothing really sort of clicked about, wartime experience, your family, that didn't come together for you for a long time.
No, not until it was explicitly told to me.
So I'm also curious. I know for my family, my dad never knew that my grandmother was in the Holocaust until they came to the United States, and then she felt the freedom to start talking about it. You write in the book that a conversation with your mom prompted you to sort of dig into this story because she mentioned that your grandfather had saved people during the war. But did your parents sort of already know the full story? And if not, were they ever curious to know more? I mean, before this sort of got to you, how did the memory of this pass down?
In the 1980s, it became slightly more permissible to talk about the Holocaust, though not entirely. And so it was at this moment that a group of basically Holocaust survivors in the hometown, my hometown, and where my family was living, they decided to sort of band together and to petition the local government and the regional government as well for basically monetary payments, a kind of pension almost, basically because they suffered during the war and they lost so much. They decided to basically publish a series of books filled with written testimonies. And this was probably I would say the early 1980s, so fairly early on. And my grandfather asked my mom, who was then, I think, a university student, maybe in her first or second year, to basically transcribe what he was telling her by hand. So she, at that age, probably for the first time, really heard the full story. I know that she filled up at least kind of a very small stack of handwritten sheets with this. So that's how I think she had heard the story. I know my uncle, he heard bits and pieces growing up, explicitly about what my grandfather had heard, but it was still sort of taboo to talk about more widely. So it was something that they really kind of kept inside the home. And really, I think it's also worth mentioning that this idea of the Holocaust, even the word Holocaust, it didn't really exist, I think, to my understanding, in the Soviet Union. It was just kind of something that many Jewish people, endured in their families as part of the broader suffering that supposedly all Soviet people of all stripes endured. And so this was just for the Jewish people, their sort of chapter of the war. That was how it was, I think, understood.
Could you, just for extra context for people who may not be familiar, can you say a little bit more about how the Soviet Union really sort of whitewashed the Jewish experience in World War II and sort of shut down any mention of the Holocaust?
Well, after the war, the Soviet authorities realized that they needed a new unifying myth to bring people back together again. And in order to do this, they decided that the new narrative would be that all Soviet citizens of all stripes had suffered equally and that they had all fought the occupiers equally. And when of course this wasn't true, Jews were the only ones who were specifically targeted for annihilation. And in fact, there were many tens of thousands of Soviet citizens that actually did side with the occupiers in various ways and did commit various crimes against, for example, Jewish people and many others. This narrative continued on until probably the late 1980s, at which point it was sort of permissible to start talking about history during sort of perestroika period in the Soviet Union. But even now, some of these topics remain somewhat taboo, I think, in Ukraine, and especially, for example, the topic of collaboration, which I think has come up fairly recently.
Can you then say more about first asking your grandfather, Motel, about the story, and also how you felt hearing it for the first time? You briefly talk in the book about how it floored you, but what were the details that stood out to you as you were hearing it for the first time?
It caught me off guard for a lot of reasons. I think first because I really didn't know much about the history of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. And I definitely didn't know about the fact that Romania had anything to do with it. So that was a shock. And I think that, again, the image of the Holocaust that I had completely stood in contrast to what I was hearing. I think there were so many elements of the story that caught me off guard. The fact that local Ukrainians, for example, perpetrated some of these crimes, that was pretty shocking to hear and something that I had not heard in any other context. But I was also, frankly, just really touched in many instances by the stories he would tell of local Ukrainians saving I'm assuming many thousands of people at a possible great cost to them if they were sort of caught harboring Jews or feeding them or helping them survive. So there were just a lot of elements to it that were completely new to me, and that it would take many years for me to fully wrap my head around, to be honest with you.
And to get more into the cognitive dissonance and all this, to, again, sort of pull from the book, you write about, even as you took classes on the Holocaust in college, it still didn't really strike you that this was your family also that might have been in this. Holocaust history, as it's often talked about and taught, really doesn't cover Eastern Europe, definitely doesn't cover crimes by Romania. So what was it like, if you can say more about, having the pieces finally click, that you were a Jew from Eastern Europe, and of course the Holocaust had come for you too?
Well, yeah, it was absolutely shocking to hear that my family was impacted to the extent that it was. In college, I had taken an introductory class at the University of Washington, and we did learn about the Soviet Union and the Holocaust, to a small extent, I would say, which in hindsight is interesting, because almost half of all Holocaust victims, died on Soviet territory. We learned, for example, that the Einsatzgruppen had swept through the Soviet Union, had massacred hundreds of thousands of civilians beginning in the summer of 1941. But that was sort of the extent of it. It led me to believe that everyone had been killed. And of course, as a result of that, it never dawned on me that there could be any other story, that there were stories of survivors. And as a result, that my family could have been at all a part of that.
In an email to me, you said your family's story is, of course, about the Holocaust, but also about what us Soviet Jewish immigrants should do when we come of age and learn about our past. Your first instinct when learning about the story was to go full journalism on it, record everything, make transcripts, do research, plan to write something, but then that trailed off. Can you say more about that, the feeling of being overwhelmed by this task? And not to sort of project on my end, but I know when I hear about my family's story, I'm always kind of caught between a feeling of, I need to write this down properly, and a sense of either, I don't know if I can, or a sense of guilt that I'm not doing it. And of course, or if I do write it down, who will read it? And I imagine this kind of guilt is felt by pretty much most immigrant kids, not just, us younger generation of Russian-speaking Jews. So would be great to hear from you more about that.
Yeah, everything you mentioned definitely it came to mind for me. I mean, first off, I just think that the fact that this chapter of the Holocaust was perpetrated by Romania, I think was maybe the primary hurdle, because the little that has been written on it is very technical in nature. It's written and intended for scholarly audiences. And I remember, when I first heard my grandfather's story, I went to the University of Washington, one of their libraries, and I requested a bunch of books via interlibrary loan. And, I came home with, a stack of books, maybe a couple of feet high. And it was really dense. I mean, even just getting into the basic history requires centuries of historical knowledge, not just of Romania, but of the Soviet Union, and some knowledge of the Holocaust itself. And so that was really daunting to begin with. And then, I asked myself, at the time I had some journalism experience. I had written for the Seattle Times in college and some other newspapers. I'd been a full-time journalist after college. But the idea of writing a 1,000-word article, or maybe 3,000 at the most, and then to sort of then make the leap to 70,000 words seemed like an impossible task. And frankly, it was very easy to sort of say one day, this is hard. I'm going to take a break. And one day break turns into a week, turns into a month, and it was very easy to put it off and sort of say, I'll leave this to somebody else to do, to cover this topic. And I just found that nobody had. And after a while, I realized it was something that I had to do, or else I would probably regret it.
So the anecdote you tell is, as you pick this back up, is in 2017, after your grandfather had died, you sort of one night started listening to the recordings again. And I wanted to ask, the way you present it in the book is almost very simple. Like, as you listen to the recordings, you come across the specific part where your grandfather says you need to write this so they remember, which then becomes the title of the book. Was it as simple as that? Was that sort of, and that was the click, and you went, okay, all of this, the barriers are gone, I'm going to do this now? Like, what was, expand on that moment more, I guess, because that seems a little like wild to just, there you are,
Yeah. Well, I should say there were definitely a few starts and stops, especially beginning in 2012, when I at least decided to start interviewing some relatives and other folks. I sat at a coffee shop a few times, tried to write something. It didn't work. For some reason, I just couldn't really find the words. And then for some reason, a few years after that, after my grandfather had passed, and after I was listening to this stuff again, after having all of this history on my mind for those years, for some reason, something clicked. Maybe it was because I was older. Maybe it was because at the time I just had my first child, and I think there was a greater sense maybe of the importance of this undertaking, and of the importance of somehow finding a way to tell the story. And yeah, it was I think almost as simple as pressing play and just hearing these stories flood back to me. I think kind of the magic of recording things is, at the moment you're talking to somebody, you're interviewing someone, afterward you might think you heard a certain story, but every time you listen to it, you sometimes derive a different meaning from it. And that has been very much the case for me, on the night you described in 2017. And almost every time I listen to a recording, there's an extra clue or an extra nugget that I maybe didn't pick up on. And so that was maybe my experience that night, and what probably prompted me to dig in further.
What do you feel like you found in 2017 that you were missing before?
I just think it was just a reminder of the weight of the story and just how incredible my family story of survival was. I thought about it here and there. I had made excuses, but hearing some of the ways in which he had survived, hearing about the people who he had saved, just continuing to do research on my own and realizing that somehow this story, Soviet Jewish survivors overall, but specifically from, this territory, just understanding how little has been written. That was my motivator. To be honest with you, I assumed that there were a couple of folks working on this sort of subject area I assumed that they would have come out with something in those intervening years. And they didn't really publish anything that kind of resembled the story that I wanted to tell. So I just felt things really click and fall into place at that time.
And how did you grapple with, if at all, the sort of detachment of the story? And what I mean by that, I know it sort of sounds weird, but even though it's your family's story, and even though this was not that long ago, it still feels that every year that passes, every new generation that grows up, we are naturally more distant from the Holocaust, and we're almost like grabbing at shadows to try and understand ourselves what happened. Did you have to face that while you were writing the book?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think one of the big criticisms of Holocaust memoirs and stories written by grandchildren is that, how could we possibly know? We're never there. We could never imagine the horrors that our grandparents had endured. But for me, my relationship with my grandparents was such that they in fact helped raise me. They lived with my parents for many years until I think I was probably midway through elementary school. I was surrounded by people of this background. When I started listening to Holocaust testimonies by people who had survived the same camps and ghettos as my grandparents, I almost felt like I was seeing my grandparents. The same mannerisms, the same manners of speech, the occasional Yiddish sort of interlude, and so it felt more intimate to me, than hearing like a stranger's voice telling me about something that I could never imagine. I would also say that I think probably the book would have less appeal if it was just written about some isolated moment in time. And I realized as I was writing it that, the story of my grandparents, I don't think they would describe themselves or define themselves as Holocaust survivors only. I mean, I think that's definitely a part of it. But I think when they talk about their lives, it's, overcoming bleak post-war prospects. It's somehow cobbling together a life for their kids despite awful standards of living, providing for their kids in the United States. I mean, all of these sorts of things. So I wanted to present a whole picture of the kind of family that had overcome these odds. Not just people who had survived the Holocaust, but the totality of the people. And so I felt comfortable with that aspect of it. And, the older I got, the more I realized that learning about their identities, learning about how, the sense of Jewishness had been stripped away from people of my background, Soviet Jews, I think it kind of inspired me to think about how this journey, would impact me and how my own identity was shaped and how I wanted to be shaped moving forward.
So it's also interesting, you sort of mentioned all that, but when you end the book on what feels to me like a real sense of bitterness. You've got this quote from a survivor of Peshera. This survivor talks about how everyone pays attention to Auschwitz and the Holocaust in Germany and Poland, but Eastern Europe is left behind. And he says, quote, "We didn't get tattoos. Our numbers are here in our hearts." And just to be brutally honest, I know I have a lot of resentment about how little Americans and American Jews know about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, but it's also kind of horrible in a way. It feels like the only way to get people to think about Eastern Europe is to fight for space from the attention given to Auschwitz. So, to sort of come back to you then, why did you end the book the way you did? And what do you think of that resentment and what we should then do with it?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's an incredibly tough line to straddle. I think there are no winners when you compare, people and who suffered the most. It was horrific, no matter which episode or which period you're talking about, which location. I think for me, in interviewing survivors and listening to their testimonies, I was struck by the fact that, I think late in their lives, especially, in let's say the 80s and 90s, the 2000s, I think many of them had come to terms, I think, a little bit with what happened. Many decades had passed. This was a long time ago. But the one thing that they did continue to struggle with was the idea that the people that they talked to didn't really understand where they were coming from. In my grandfather's case, thought he had come across the name of another boy back in 1943 who he had saved, but it was basically a misunderstanding. And as a result, he felt like he would never basically have his story validated. I think that's late in his life. That's what really affected him more than perhaps even what had happened to him as a child survivor. And so I think in the case of the survivor you're talking about, Mikhail Bartik, I think for him, he was one of the few people in Tulchin, the town where my grandfather was from, that really took it upon themselves to preserve the memory of what had happened. And he, time and time again, beginning in the late 1980s, when he first fought to have a plaque placed on the former camp wall, he ran up against a local government that frankly didn't seem to care one way or another about preserving the memory of what had happened. I think this sort of indifference to suffering, to history, I think that's what really wore away at them late in their lives. And so, yeah, I think that for me was, I think, an important perspective to share.
So when you're looking at the story, what would you say are sort of the takeaways for you now that you've not only learned it, but also gotten the ability to simmer sort of with it and write this book? To me, that's sort of a two-part question. What do you take away from it personally, but also what do you want at the end of the day other people to take away from the story you've written?
Well, I think for me personally, writing about the Holocaust, I think it showed me how my own family's relationship with Judaism was shaped. The Holocaust was, of course, the central event in my family's life, but the sense of Jewishness, that was framed much earlier. I think on my grandmother's side, I know for sure that she belonged to an Orthodox or a family that practiced Orthodox Judaism. I know that they were incredibly devout people. And then, the Soviet Union comes into power in 1922, and all of a sudden, Judaism and other religions are denigrated. There is an attempt to strip Judaism away from Jewish people, such that it's more cultural than religious. And slowly, over a period of time, you have people who are kind of divorced from their faith in a way. And then, of course, the Holocaust happens, and you have a large percentage of people who die. And then when the survivors return, they realize that the former shtetls, the physical neighborhoods that they had once known are no more, that they can no longer live amongst themselves. So they live amongst Ukrainians. They become, in some cases, almost ashamed or afraid to speak Yiddish. And then, of course, the Soviet Union, the anti-Semitism ramps up after the war under Stalin, 1948 to 1953. And afterward, it's certainly no picnic either. People are afraid to so much as 5 matzah for Passover. It really continues on, and to the point where, when I think my mom came to this country, she didn't even know how to, light a menorah. And, for a long time, we didn't even acknowledge or celebrate any Jewish holidays. And so I think in learning and telling this story, that for me, stood out. And I think it's something that is on my mind now with 2 young kids, and thinking about how I want to raise them and how I want them to feel about their heritage, which is hopefully going to be much different than I felt about it growing up. So for me, I think that's my personal takeaway. And, for other people and other listeners, I think hopefully the takeaway is just giving people a knowledge of just how expansive the Holocaust was and just how many different people were affected by it. And just a glimpse into maybe the voices of people who they haven't heard from yet.
I want to dig in a little bit more into the sort of takeaways aspect, especially because it's almost impossible to take any clear lessons away about sort of people and humanity. You've got a story where there are Ukrainians helping Jews and Ukrainians abusing Jews, where there are Jews taking advantage of other Jews and rich Jews sending poor Jews they didn't like outside of the ghetto to die first. Is there something more to learn about people here? I guess I'm so used to thinking about all of this on a pure family level. This is your story. You should know it. It's important to know so you can navigate family dynamics, and also so you can kind of exercise as much trauma as possible so we don't beat our kids over the head with it too. But is there anything beyond that to learn for us personally?
Yeah, I really struggle with this too. I know that, another criticism of Holocaust literature in the West is that there's always this kind of redemptive arc, right? There's always, for some reason, a need to have a feel-good ending. I don't think that could be possible in this story. And so, to your point, what's the takeaway? I think for me, the takeaway here is probably different than, what you might find in an Elie Wiesel book or, Anne Frank. I think the takeaway here is that, and, I mentioned earlier that the camps and ghettos in this territory of occupied Ukraine that I'm talking about, they were porous. And as a result, there was a high level of basically interaction between Jews and local non-Jewish Ukrainian people. And the Ukrainian people helped save my family. They helped save thousands of families like mine, despite the fact that, yes, a small number of people did collaborate. And I think it's worth really examining to what extent people might take risks like that today. It's hard to imagine, a needy family coming to someone's door today and receiving the kind of care and attention that I had read about and heard about. It's hard to imagine people risking their lives to save people that aren't like them, despite the horrific conditions that might exist. So I think there are definitely lessons to be learned there about basically finding a way to bridge our differences and to take care of one another, to treat one another with respect, because we see what happens when dark forces try to pull us apart, and it's not a pretty picture.
Has putting all this story together changed your relationship to sort of Ukraine as a whole? Because you haven't been back since you first immigrated here, right?
That's correct. I have not been back, although I tried to, but unfortunately I booked my plane tickets right as COVID hit. So no, I haven't been back. But as far as my relationship with Ukraine, I saw a number of tweets. I think you posted a really fantastic article with your take on it. I think I would kind of agree, before the invasion that happened this month, before the war broke out, I would probably have had a very mixed opinion. My country of birth, I mean, on the one hand, it's obviously where Jews found refuge many hundreds of years ago when they were banished from Western and Central Europe. It's where religious and cultural life flourished. Then again, it's where, anti-Semitism reigned for a long time, and where thousands of Jews were killed during various violent episodes. It's, of course, where the Holocaust happened. It's where post-war anti-Semitism was quite strong. And so from that perspective, I had a mixed opinion, but it's amazing how the events of the past week have really changed. I mean, we have a Jewish president who has captured the imagination of the world, and the entire country and world seems to be rallying around him. So I think my pride in having been born in Ukraine and a Ukrainian president with Jewish background has definitely changed some things for me.
Yeah, I feel like I keep having sort of the same round of conversations with my parents of like, we never expected to become like Ukrainian like nationalists essentially at this point.
It's true. Or to sort of see like the Ukrainian Jewish identity being forged. Because I don't know if that's something that you experienced, but it's interesting to see how that has changed in the past 8 years.
Yeah, I know. Just to, I guess, say briefly, when I was there, it was fascinating to hear stories. Like I remember very prominently a story of during the Euromaidan revolution in 2014, one of the like local Chabad rabbis or somebody getting up and speaking in Ukrainian to the crowd in support of the revolution against Russia. So I think like being there in 2018, I definitely got the impression that like once 2014 happened, everything changed. That was, the entire national identity came together in a way that was really, really cohesive for the Jews there, which was bizarre to me, but also kind of awesome to see.
That's exactly it. It's bizarre because, we make jokes today about not knowing what to call ourselves, right? It's like, are we FSU Jews or Russian-speaking Jews from Ukraine, or like what, and I'm describing people that obviously immigrated here, or were born to immigrant families, many decades ago. So yeah, it's just a fascinating evolution.
Can I say, I definitely appreciate it. I think in one of the emails you sent me, you said Soviet Jews when referencing like us who live here. And I was like, that's more accurate than pretty much any other sort of term I've heard. Because even when we say like Russian Jews, like the Jews here are not really like we're Soviet descendant, basically. So it was just fascinating to hear that from you as well.
It's also interesting to see how people kind of gloss over that in their analysis of Jews in Ukraine now. And they only say, it's the Holocaust happened, but everything's great now, right? But they ignore the fact that so many people left because it was bad. So I just think that's interesting too.
I'm also wondering, to come back to the really Jewish side of things, because you also write a little bit in the book about your sort of the really interesting immigrant transition of coming to the U.S. and then slowly being pulled into Jewish life and then going to an Orthodox synagogue, which I think for most sort of Soviet Jews in the U.S., the synagogue we don't go to is an Orthodox or Chabad synagogue, but then sort of drifting away from that as well. I'm wondering if, especially after completing this book, has that sort of changed your relationship to Judaism as you're talking about, raising your kids? Where does that leave you?
Yeah, I write in the book about our family's first years in the U.S. and my father especially feeling like now that we were free to practice our religion that we should. And so, with Orthodox Judaism being kind of the form that we were probably most familiar with or comfortable with, that's what we went with. So we went to an Orthodox temple that was close by, and we went there, I think, for probably off and on for a year or two. I kind of blame myself, although it was probably not really the case, but, for kind of constantly whining about having to go to Hebrew school and stuff like that. Probably 2 decades have passed since I even thought about it or thought about attending again. I think what really happened was after my first child was born, we were in search of a childcare, basically. And it so happened that the only kind of slot that was available was at a kind of a Jewish institution. After a few months, they had their first Jewish holiday. So we went to that and kind of celebrated with all the kids. And then all of a sudden, all these sort of memories kind of came back to me of, when I was a kid going to synagogue or, some of the Jewish summer camps that I was a part of. And it was so cool, like, watching my kids over the last couple of years really embrace that stuff. We get books in the mail. I forgot what they're called.
PJ Library?
Yes, exactly. So that's been a huge thing. So we get holiday kits in the mail. So just stuff that I would have never experienced, I think, after our first couple of years in the U.S., helping provide that to my kids just as a baseline. I just feel so great about it that I can at least shape that sort of identity. And then as far as, Hebrew school and those kinds of things, I think that's definitely on the horizon too. So writing this book and learning more about, maybe reflecting more and meditating more on, our journey to the U.S. and the first few years and maybe what we lost a century ago, I think has been illuminating. Yeah.
There are many things not so great about the American Jewish community, but that right there is a great advertisement. They get the kids, they get the family. So
exactly. That's exactly it.
What about, have you thought at all in terms of like when you're going to reach the subject of this story with your kids?
I've thought about that a lot. But, to me, it seems like human nature is for people maybe not to care so much about their family stories until they're in their 20s and 30s when they can appreciate it. So my expectations of them and being kind of interested in this stuff is pretty low just because, I can remember myself not even asking many questions until I was, in my early 20s when all I wanted to do was kind of be away from home and now I have to, get into those things. So, I think it'll come up at a certain point, but I don't think it's going to be something that I'll kind of push onto them. I just have a feeling that their curiosity will at some point be piqued.
So the last question I have for you is, The book is done, it's out, people are reading it. How does it just sort of overall feel to have completed this decade-long journey? Is there, I don't know, any sense of peace that you found after finishing this?
I think one of the coolest aspects of finishing the book has probably been just the fact that, I've gotten kind of emails out of the blue from people of my background, and specifically people who, of my parents or my grandparents' age, who survived or who know people who have survived the Holocaust in Transnistria. And it's just fascinating to hear that them sort of explain that for so long, they don't feel like their story has been told. And to have, a book where they feel they can see themselves and their families in it has been rewarding for them. I think that's been incredible and sort of unexpected. And also it's incredible just because of the relatively few people in the world that might have been touched by that. To have that human connection, to make it a little bit more real has been surprising. But I think as far as closure, I don't necessarily feel that way, because it seems like, every other week something bubbles up where, I feel that the challenges that I raise in my book, whether it's about preserving memory or other things, are maybe aren't going so well. I mean, in Romania, for example, there was a recent poll that showed that something like 32% of people believed that the Holocaust took place on Romanian territory. So when you're faced with those numbers, it's hard to feel like that anything sort of can be accomplished with the book. But I'll say on a personal note, just having it done and feeling like, I did my best given the circumstances, I think that part has at least been rewarding.
Sorry, just to go back to that statistic, under a third of Romanians believe the Holocaust happened on Romanian territory?
Yeah, 32% of the people surveyed by the Elie Wiesel Institute in Bucharest say that the Holocaust happened on Romanian territory. And of those, about 2/3 say that of the Jews sent to camps and ghettos, they were sent to Nazi camps and ghettos. So in other words, they have a hard time believing that the Romanians could have established these sorts of horrific places.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news, stories, or reports referenced for this episode.